In this module, we'll consider briefly the influence of key historical figures in influencing the paradigms of realism and liberalism. So it's worth re-emphasizing that the theory of classical realism and classical liberalism were developed in the 20th century. None of the scholars we're going to discuss in this module would consider themselves to be realists or liberalists, but their thoughts do align to the precepts of one of the two schools. So realism and liberalism drew upon various political ideas that were developed much earlier. So of the realist scholars, I'm going to look at Thucydides, Hobbes and von Clausewitz. Oh, you see there, I did the wrong thing by describing them as realist scholars, the scholars that influenced realism. Conspicuously absent from the list is Machiavelli, who I will be discussing in a separate case study on Vladimir Putin. Thucydides, who lived from 460 to 400 BC, wrote a very famous text called The History of the Peloponnesian War. And one passage within this text in particular, the Melian Dialogue, is said to illustrate two cardinal principles of political realism. First, that power politics is the name of the game in relation between states, and second, that issues of morality or ethics are irrelevant in the sphere of power politics. So the following clip plays out the exact wording of the Melian Dialogue written by Thucydides in a more modern setting. Listen very carefully to some of the language that is used in this confrontation between the powerful Athenians and the weak yet independent and justice-minded Melians. So at this stage in the Peloponnesian War, Milos did not want to become involved in the conflict between Athens and the Peloponnesian League that was led by Sparta, but the Athenians would have none of this attitude.
Before attacking, the Athenians sent representatives to negotiate.
We've not come to make set speeches to you, but calmly to discuss our mutual interests. We invite you, therefore, to say freely what you think, and to criticize openly whatever we may say.
That sounds very reasonable, and we agree that each side should put forward their views calmly. Yet what is scarcely consistent with such a proposal is the threat, indeed the certainty, of your making war on us. We fear that even if we prove we're in the right, you will still try to destroy us.
But if you're going to spend the time voicing your suspicions about the future, or if you have met here for any other purpose than to face the facts and to try to save your city from destruction, there is no point in our going on with this discussion.
You have invited us to say what we think. And it is natural that we should have different points of view. So, tell us first what you propose.
For our part, we will use no fine phrases, saying, for example, that we have a right to our empire because we defeated the Persians, or we come against you because you have wronged us. We would simply ask you, on your part, not to deny that you're a threat to us.
We recommend that you try to get what it is possible for you to get. You will understand that justice depends on one's power to enforce it.
Then, in our view, since you will not allow us to speak of justice, but only of expedience, we do think it useful for you, as much as for us, to maintain the principle that there should be just dealing between all states. Otherwise, you might someday find your own fall attended by the most terrible vengeance.
That is something you can leave us to worry about.
Let us rather look clearly at your situation.
What would you suggest?
We think you should surrender.
This would save you from destruction and enable us to profit from your resources.
You would not agree to our being neutral?
No.
You must understand that if you remain neutral, and if we remained on friendly terms with you, our subjects and other neutral states would simply regard it as a sign of our weakness.
But when they see what is happening here, surely the neutral states will conclude that in course of time you will attack them too.
But to be frank with you, we're not particularly worried about the mainland states any more than we fear the Spartan army. We are more concerned about islands outside our empire, like yourselves, who threaten our sea routes, or subjects who have already become embittered by the constraint which our empire imposes on them.
But surely, if such violent steps are taken by you to keep your empire, and by your subjects to escape from it, we who are still free would be foolish not to face you firmly, rather than to submit to slavery.
No, not if you're sensible. We're far too strong for you.
Oh, the fortunes of war are not always settled by greater strength. Your own past example against the Persians gives us hope.
Hope is apt to be an expensive commodity.
Our position is difficult, and you may be sure that we know it. Nevertheless, we have a kind of strength which you lack.
We should be interested to hear of it.
We are standing for what is right against what is wrong.
Ah, yes. Men in a hard position generally say that. They do so simply to give themselves a kind of moral glow rather than to define any reality. In our opinion, common sense is the sounder morality, and to ask oneself where one's interests lie is more useful than a generalized feeling that one is acting nobly.
Common sense suggests to us that what we lack in power will be made up for by our friendship with the Spartans, for such friendship is in their interest as much as ours. Past history also suggests that the outcome of war is full of surprises, and that since we are in the right, the gods are more likely to favor us rather than you.
As far as the favor of the gods is concerned, we believe we have as much right to it as you have. Our beliefs about the gods and our knowledge of men suggest to us it is a necessary law of nature to rule wherever one can.
And as for your confidence that Sparta will help you, we would point out that though the Spartans are sound enough over their own affairs, their foreign policy is not especially dependable. Milos is an island. We are in control of the sea.
We put our trust in the gods and in the Spartans. We will not surrender in a moment the liberty which our city has enjoyed for 700 years. We are sorry.
We are sorry too.
And we would like to say that you seem unique in supposing the future more certain than what is before your eyes. Simply because you would like to believe it so?
The Athenians immediately began to besiege Milos. As there was some treachery from inside, the Melians were soon compelled to surrender. This time, the Athenians did put to death all the men of military age and sold the women and children of Milos as slaves.
One last important contribution that Thucydides made is he spoke about the idea that when one power or one country or entity becomes too powerful, this will precipitate others allying against that power and create a security dilemma. This is something that neorealists use to analyse current conflicts such as the South China Sea, and we will come back to that next week. Moving on to another prominent antecedent to realism, Thomas Hobbes, an English scholar who lived from 1588 to 1679. Hobbes is the primary exponent of a state of nature that is predominantly violent, dangerous, and to be avoided at all costs. So this accords with a pessimistic interpretation of human nature. So for Hobbes, in the state of nature, people's worst instincts are unrestrained because they are struggling for survival in a dangerous environment. And insecurity in turn leads to an aggressive urge to dominate others. And this underpins, of course, the realist theory of power politics. With no rule that would establish rules and principles to live by, there is no sense of common purpose, no common morality or common life. With this in mind, Hobbes characterizes life in the state of nature as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Now, as a remedy to this, he says that a political community or state must be established to maintain order, justice, and morality through a sovereign ruler, a Leviathan, as the title rather of his famous book alludes to. People must enter into a social contract under the protection of the sovereign to ensure their survival. And if this sovereign, in Hobbes's case a king, fails to ensure security, then the situation can lapse back into the anarchic state of nature. So, above all, a ruler or a government must maintain order and security. This is their primary purpose. It's important to remember that Hobbes, like the other theorists we're discussing, is a product of his time. He was witness to a bloody civil war in the UK that cleft the country in twain, and so he saw the establishment of a monarch with almost total power as the most expedient way of immediately meeting the needs of English society, to ensure that violence didn't run rampant across that country. And you will notice, if you do some further digging, that every international relations theory and theorist is influenced by the political settings that they are witness to, by the historical period in which they are located. Lastly, I wanted to mention Karl von Clausewitz briefly, who lived from 1780 to 1831, the author of the famous text on war. And if you're a security studies major, this is something that you will be very familiar with. That text focuses on the complexities of actually conducting war, the uncertainties that go with it, and the frailty of human nature. And von Clausewitz believed that war is simply the continuation of politics by other means. So that concludes a very brief snapshot of three of the key thinkers that influenced classical realism. Two important thinkers whom I wanted to mention first that contributed to the establishment, or the basis rather, of liberalism as a school of political thought, Hugo Grotius and Samuel Pufendorf, both of whom experienced the 30 Years' War and elaborated theories concerning peace, security and justice, all of which they believed went hand in hand, or go hand in hand. Grotius subscribed to a basic natural law theory of self-preservation, similar to that of Hobbes. But unlike Hobbes, he also argued for the possibility of universal moral standards, against which the legitimacy of actions and pursuit of self-preservation could be judged. Grotius formulated some of the earliest ideas in the modern period about sociability of the international sphere. He was also known for promoting ideas about religious tolerance that were compatible with that of natural rights. This, it is argued, forms the basis of what we now define as universal human rights. Pufendorf's work similarly incorporated a natural law of self-preservation in his work on universal jurisprudence. He too promoted the essential sociability of humans, which served to counter excessive self-interest. The logic being that because humans are inherently social creatures, this dog-eat-dog world or state of being that Hobbes describes may not be accurate when we are defining what it is to be human. Yet Pufendorf, unlike Grotius, who believed that natural law existed regardless of whether God existed, Pufendorf, once again it must be emphasized, a creature of his time, argued that because sanctions are essential to any concept of law, natural law can only be made binding if people believe in eternal punishments for breaking these laws and eternal rewards for preserving natural law. An all-seeing punitive God, therefore, for Pufendorf is essential to any concept of natural law. Now, here we can note that this conception overcomes one of the principal problems of international relations, and that is anarchy, as it provides this overarching authority figure that has an enforcement capacity. It dispenses sanctions for breaking natural law. Others have argued that this is what is necessary in the global sphere. An entity that can enforce punishments upon those who breach international norms or established international laws. And you could say that this underpins the United Nations logic when it places economic or other sanctions on countries that aren't behaving themselves. And the effectiveness of those sanctions, of course, is another matter. Moving forward, one of the best known figures in the history of liberal thought is Immanuel Kant, the author of Perpetual Peace, which was published in 1795. Kant agreed with Hobbes that peace and security must be established with the authority of a civil state. Moving to the realm of international relations, he said that in order to secure a lasting peace amongst states, there should be a law of nations founded on a federation of free states and based on 6 preliminary propositions. First, the conditions for permanently valid peace treaties among states must be based on republican, that is, democratic constitutions. Second, states must be co-equal in status, i.e. co-equal in judicial authority. Third, standing armies must eventually be abolished. Fourth, national debts to be managed in such a way that they cannot be used as a justification for war. Fifth, there must be prohibitions on the use of force to interfere in the internal constitutional affairs of other states. And finally, there must be prohibitions on the use of assassins or other political saboteurs or the incitement to treason within other states. Some of these principles are embedded now in international law, while others are far from being achieved, such as, of course, in Principle 3. Nearly all countries have a standing army today, with the exception perhaps of Costa Rica and Japan, which has self-defense forces rather than a military, at least according to Article 9 of its constitution. Kant proposed, moreover, that under republican forms of government, the rationale individual concept of self-preservation would ensure that citizens effectively vetoed warmongering. The internal constitution of states, insofar as they are republican, determines the condition of the external or international sphere, which will be governed in turn by the same considerations. So it's the makeup of states themselves, it's their governing philosophy which influences how they will behave in the international sphere. What this is a clear formulation of the rationale behind the influential democratic peace thesis which was prominent in the post-Cold War period. That is, that republics in Kant's time, democracies directly after the Cold War, are inherently pacific in their nature, and if all countries are republics or democracies, then there will be no war. We will come back to that latter theory in 2 weeks when discussing neorealism, liberalism rather. So in the next module, we'll solidify these theoretical propositions within the framework of 2 coherent schools of international relations theory.